I'm here in Harmony, Pennsylvania, outside of a little cabin where Joseph and Emma Smith made their first home together as a married couple. And it's in this cabin where the first phase of the translation of the Book of Mormon took place. Joseph, with his wife Emma acting as scribe and Martin Harris assisting, produced the earliest manuscript of the Book of Mormon. Unfortunately, this phase of translation ends in disaster. The manuscript is lost, and even today, we don't know where it is. We're going to take the next few minutes to explore a little bit about the circumstances where the manuscript was lost, how it was lost, and even maybe what was on the manuscript itself. My name is Casey Griffiths, and I love learning about church history. Join me as we travel the world and explore the history of the Latter-day Saints. This is Restoration Revealed. Sometime after receiving the plates from the hill Cumorah, Joseph moved to Harmony, Pennsylvania to avoid persecution. It was here that he was finally able to really start translating. Here you'll find Emma's father's home, Joseph and Emma's home, a cemetery, and the priesthood restoration site. Joseph Smith and his scribes, chiefly Martin Harris, translate for several months until they produced a pretty healthy-sized manuscript. Although we normally refer to this as the 116 pages, recent research suggests that it was much more than that. And they knew they would have a natural stopping point because Emma Smith was going to give birth to her first child. So knowing that they were going to have to stop, Martin Harris asked Joseph Smith if he could take the manuscript back to his home in Palmyra, New York. Martin had sacrificed a lot to translate. He was a successful farmer, but he didn't attend their planting season. He may have also missed his daughter's wedding. He needed to show his family that it wasn't for nothing. Joseph Smith was incredibly apprehensive about this. According to his own history, he asked the Lord once, he asked the Lord twice, and was told no both times. But the third time he asked the Lord says yes, if Martin will covenant to only show the manuscript to 4 people and to keep it under lock and key the rest of the time. So with a great amount of apprehension, Joseph Smith watches Martin Harris go up the road with the manuscript, not knowing what's going to happen. While they're waiting for Martin to send any kind of communication, disaster strikes. Here in the cemetery, right near Joseph and Emma's home, is a little tiny headstone that long ago fell over, then was taken, propped up, and placed into a more permanent marker. The headstone reads, "In memory of an infant son of Joseph and Emma Smith, June 15th, 1828. That's right when Martin is in Palmyra with the manuscript. Emma gives birth, the baby dies, and then Emma almost dies too. So for 2 weeks, Joseph Smith is at his wife's bedside, making sure that she's okay and unable to check on the status of the manuscript. Finally, at the end of those 2 weeks, Emma is the one who tells Joseph he needs to go to Palmyra and he needs to find out what's happened to the manuscript. She says that her family can take care of her, and Joseph leaves to try and find out the status of Martin and the manuscript that he has with him. Joseph then travels north, back up to Palmyra, where his family lived near Martin Harris. We are now at the Smith family farm, where years earlier, Joseph had seen God the Father and Jesus Christ, as well as the angel Moroni. Right here is the Smith family frame home. Alvin Smith started building this for his parents before he passed away in 1823. And this is the spot the Smiths were living in when the whole episode with the lost manuscript happens. When he gets here, immediately sends one of his brothers to go and get Martin Harris, whose farm is about a mile down the road from here. Joseph would have been in this home the next morning when Martin Harris shows up several hours late. They would have watched through the windows as Martin paces back and forth in front of the fence, opening the gate, shutting the gate, according to Lucy Mack Smith. And this is when they start to realize that something must have gone wrong. Martin comes in, sits down. There's a few moments of awkward silence, and then he starts to weep and explains that the manuscript is gone and he doesn't know where it is. Joseph Smith, in response, jumps up and says, "My soul is lost. What have I done? I've broken the compact I made with the Lord. And this is where the bad news first arrives, that the manuscript of the Book of Mormon is gone. Eventually, Joseph Smith would begin a second attempt of translating the Book of Mormon, this time with Oliver Cowdery as the scribe. And the rest of that story is history, except for one detail. Whatever happened to the lost manuscript? We're back in Utah at Scripture Central headquarters. We're going to meet with Don Bradley, who has done extensive research on the lost manuscript. Some of this will surprise you. Don, thanks for being here with us. We get to talk about kind of a unique subject today, which is the lost manuscript of the Book of Mormon. We brought you in because you wrote a book called The Lost 116 Pages, Reconstructing the Book of Mormon's Missing Stories. Do we have any idea what happened to the manuscript? Is there any direction you can point us in?
It turns out that Martin initially suspects that his wife, Lucy Harris, took the manuscript. He never thinks, based on his own accounts, that she burned it. He thought that she hid it or gave it to someone else, right? He actually pretty quickly becomes, or at least within several years, he becomes quite convinced she did not take it. Why? Martin told his son repeatedly that on her deathbed, Lucy Harris denied having been involved with the manuscript theft, knowing where the manuscript was. And one thing that we do know about Lucy Harris is she was a devout Quaker. And one of the key expectations of Quakers is they will not lie. And so the idea, first of all, that a devoutly religious woman would go to meet her God with this lie on her lips is a stretch, okay? In fact, it was understood at this time in common law that someone who gave a testimony on their deathbed, that was considered to be very weighty, legally admissible testimony. Because the idea was people will not lie on their deathbeds when they're going to meet God. The idea that a devout Quaker would do that seems even more difficult to swallow, right? And so Martin and Lucy Harris did not get along. They had separated by the time that she died, right? Yeah. So Martin Harris did not have some rosy view of Lucy Harris, but he knew her well enough to know that she was very devout. And so her deathbed testimony denying that she knew what had happened to that manuscript convinced him that she was not the one who had taken the manuscript. And so there are other reasons to doubt that Lucy Harris was the culprit. It's possible she's involved obliquely, but she denies she knows what happened to the manuscript, right? In the end, at least. I identify other sort of suspects, one of which is actually the Harris' son-in-law. So when the daughter, Lucy, gets married in May 1828, she marries a guy named Flanders Dyke, who it turns out is from a family of swindlers. They do a number of swindles in upstate New York right around this time. And so there are reasons to suspect this character. He actually had previously stolen the Anthon transcript, according to Lucy Mack Smith. So he's a shady character who's stealing documents related to the coming forth of the Book of Mormon. Why not the lost pages, right? There are also treasure diggers who felt that they had a right to the gold plates, who had tried to steal the gold plates. There are also suspects here. They've been trying to steal the plates. Why not steal the manuscript that's produced from those plates?
Yeah.
Did the manuscript survive? Did it survive very long? Was it destroyed at some point early on?
Is it in someone's attic right now?
So I actually do have a source from about 50 years after the manuscript theft where someone who was a reputable non-Latter-day Saint in that area who said he knew exactly where the manuscript was and that it was nearby. And so that I find interesting, right? Because it does at least suggest that the manuscript had survived a half century. If it survived a half century, it could have kept surviving. Goodness knows where it'd be. Yeah, like you're saying, maybe in someone's attic. If it's out there, I suspect that the person who has it doesn't know what they have. And I would think that if it was still out there, that it would have surfaced by now. But if there's some reason to think it had survived for a good while after the theft, and it would just be the coolest thing ever if it were found. I am certainly hopeful that it's out there.
Well, let's pivot to another interesting thing you do in your book, which are there are some sources that talk about the content of the lost manuscript, like what it actually said. We know a few things from Joseph, like it's Mormon's abridgment, that it covers the first half of the Book of Mormon, and he calls it the Book of Lehi in the preface of the Book of Mormon. What else do we know about what's in the manuscript?
So Emma says that she's amazed that he could have translated this, that he was very undereducated, right? And so as examples of this, she notes that when the name Sariah was mentioned first in the book, he doesn't know how to pronounce it. And she has to help him pronounce the name. He spells it out, and then she has to pronounce it for him. She also notes that when the translation mentioned the walls of Jerusalem, he suddenly seemed shocked and said, "Emma, did Jerusalem have walls?" And she told him yes. And then he calmed down and he said, "Oh, I thought I'd been deceived," right? So he's translating, he's like, that doesn't seem right. I didn't think Jerusalem had walls, right? So the significance she sees in this is Joseph doesn't really know his Bible. He doesn't know how to pronounce, this name and so on. He's unlearned, so he couldn't have produced this on his own. Another significance that it has for us is she's actually giving us the exact clues we need to know where she was scribing for him. What part were they translating together?
Right. She talks about Jerusalem, talks about walls around Jerusalem.
And then where would the name Sariah have first been mentioned in the text? At the very beginning of the narrative. And so what this does is it pegs for us where Emma was scribing for the translation. It's at the very beginning of the book. We have multiple accounts of statements that Joseph Smith made where he gives just like a little nugget from the lost pages. Joseph Smith was once asked in Nauvoo, if Lehi was a descendant of Manasseh, why would the Book of Mormon be the stick of Ephraim? And what Franklin D. Richards overheard Joseph Smith answering about this is, he said, if we had those pages that Martin Harris lost, then you would see that it says that Ishmael, whose daughters marry Lehi's sons, was a descendant of Ephraim. So the Book of Mormon peoples were not only of Manasseh, they're also of Ephraim. And so that's how he's tying it to that prophecy. Right?
Stick of Joseph.
Right. And so we know Joseph himself remembered some details from the lost manuscript. Fortunately, there are other witnesses who talk some about what was in the lost pages. Martin Harris had a brother, Emer, right, who lays out about how many people were in Mulek's group that escaped from the Babylonian invasion, who they were, and so on. He would have this information because his brother scribed for that part of the text, right? We have accounts from other people who were close associates of Martin Harris. So Martin does seem to have talked about it. Now, again, I haven't found a source yet where somebody says, okay, Martin Harris, tell me everything you remember, what's in the lost pages. I hope somebody did that. If so, it's in, somebody's journal or something. But we have bits and pieces that he tells different people. We have an extensive interview that was done by Fayette Lapham early in 1830. They're living in Palmyra. They're hearing the buzz about this book that's about to come out. But the book's still at press. They can't read it yet. They show up at the Joseph Smith Sr. house, right, looking for information. Joseph Jr. is now living back down in Pennsylvania, so they talk to Joseph Sr. He gives them an extensive recitation of the coming forth of the Book of Mormon, some aspects of which we can tell are clearly garbled, right, when we compare them with other information, but some aspects of which are so spot on, they match accounts that we have that weren't published until long after Fayette Lapham's account was published. So we know the guy had inside information because there's no other way he could know these things. Fayette Lapham not only reports from Joseph Smith Sr. details of the coming forth of the Book of Mormon, then he starts launching into the actual narrative of the Book of Mormon. And a lot of it's familiar narrative, right? Well, there's this guy God speaks to, this ancient Israelite, and God leads him on a sort of exodus out in the wilderness, right? And very familiar stuff from the Book of Mormon. He lays out details of Book of Mormon narrative that would fit into our existing narrative, but are not in that narrative. So for instance, when he's giving the story of Laban and the brass plates, he says that Nephi finds this guy lying drunk in the street because there's a great feast going on in Jerusalem at that time. This gives a clue to like a Jewish festival context for the recovery, Nephi's recovery of the brass plates. The Book of Mormon text that we have in the small plates doesn't say there was a feast going on, but it says things that actually, when you think about it, are consistent with that, right? So, for instance, Laban had been out by night among the elders of the Jews, but he's drunk. The elders of the Jews, these are high-profile drinking buddies, if that's all this is, right? And he's wearing armor. He's overdressed for going out drinking, right? This suggests more of a ceremonial occasion for his drunkenness out with the elders of the Jews rather than just carousing, right? So there are things in our extant text that would fit with a festival context, even though it doesn't spell out a festival context. I guess I'll go into the another story.
Yeah,
that's good.
Yeah, let's hear it.
A question that scholars have raised a lot about the Book of Mormon. They have noted that the Book of Mormon raises certain questions that in its text that it doesn't answer in the text. And one of these is about the interpreters. So we know the Jaredite interpreters were first given to the brother of Jared. We're given that narrative in detail. We know that later they're being used by the Nephite kings, but we're not told anywhere in the Book of Mormon how the Nephites got the interpreters. Another question I forgot to mention that scholars have brought up is, why did the Liahona, why don't they use the Liahona later in Nephite history? They only use it early. There's a glaring omission here in the narrative, right? It turns out that Fayette Lapham, reporting what he hears from Joseph Smith Sr., gives a narrative of how the Nephites got the Jaredite interpreters. Fayette Lapham was never a Latter-day Saint. He doesn't appear to have ever read the Book of Mormon. How would he have happened to come up with a narrative that answers a question that the Book of Mormon raises but never answers, that scholars have noted? Right? It does not seem likely he would somehow stumble onto such a narrative on his own. The narrative, as he gives it from Joseph Smith Sr., is that sometime after they're in the New World, they're going on a kind of exodus and they have a tabernacle, like a portable temple. I argue that he's talking about the exodus of Mosiah I leads from the land of Nephi to the land of Zarahemla. And he says that they're being led on this exodus by the Liahona. He's led by it to an object. He does not know what the object is. He doesn't know what it's for. He doesn't know how to use it. And so he takes it in his hand and he carries it, got it in his hand. He goes into the tabernacle to ask the Lord, what do I do with this? And the voice of the Lord speaks to him. I'm picturing from behind the veil of the Holy of Holies, where the Lord's presence was understood to reside. Right? The voice of the Lord speaks to him and asks him, what is that in your hand? And the man says he did not know, but had come to inquire. He's having a temple dialogue with the Lord, presumably through the veil, and the Lord says to him, put it on your face and cover your face with an animal skin. And he does, and he can see anything. It's the interpreters, right? So this is the explanation given by Joseph Smith Sr. for how the Nephites got the Jaredite interpreters. He then says that once the guy used the interpreters, the Liahona stopped working. This would explain why they stopped using the Liahona and how they got the Jaredite interpreters. And the story, the narrative that he gives, absolutely fascinating, right? It has parallels to the story of the brother of Jared getting the interpreters in the first place through a dialogue with the Lord through the veil on top of Mount Shelem, a sort of temple context, right? And then the exact nature of parts of the dialogue that Joseph Smith Sr. gives are strikingly familiar to me as a Latter-day Saint who's been through the temple, right? And then even the detail of, put the artifact on your face and cover it with an animal skin. Well, famously and controversially, Joseph Smith used his hat, right, in connection with the seeing implements. Certainly with the seer stones, we're told he puts them in his hat, right, to block out the external light so you can just perceive the spiritual light of the seeing instrument. Some people say he does the same thing with the interpreters, right? He has the interpreters, then covers his face with this hat. Well, this narrative of Joseph Smith Sr. got me to look into, what do we know about Joseph Smith's hat? And it turns out it's a beaver skin hat. It's an animal skin. And so people are sort of up in arms. Smith put his face in a hat, right? Well, maybe Joseph Smith's not thinking this is putting his face in a hat, but covering his face with an animal skin, like certain sacred relics of the biblical tabernacle were wrapped in animal skins while they were transported. And in this story from Joseph Smith Sr., the interpreters, the way that the Nephites use them is they covered their face with an animal skin. When Joseph Smith uses his hat, that's what he's doing. He's covering his face with an animal skin. And so I argued, there are all kinds of echoes of narratives of the parallels with narratives in the Hebrew Bible, in the lost pages of the Book of Mormon, what we can piece together from them, right? There are parallels to our endowment, right? And so there may be things that we can learn to understand better appreciate about our temple ordinances, as well as about the Book of Mormon, part of the Book of Mormon text that we have from studying what we can know of what was in those lost pages of the Book of Mormon.
Wow. Well, Don, your research is incredible. So thank you so much for taking the time to meet with you. I really appreciate it. With Don's excellent research, we now have a much better understanding of the lost manuscript. But there's one new question I have. What about Martin Harris? So we're back in Palmyra, New York, at the Martin Harris farm. Unfortunately, Martin Harris is only associated by most church members with the lost manuscript of the Book of Mormon, but he did a lot of important things. He's one of the 3 witnesses of the Book of Mormon. He stays faithful to that witness throughout his life. And most importantly, the farm that we're standing on right now, he mortgaged to pay for the Book of Mormon. So he's probably the most important figure when it comes to financing the Book of Mormon, getting it printed and getting into the hands of people. In fact, one person, Pomeroy Tucker, said that they saw Martin Harris preaching. A guy came up and hit him. And Martin Harris said that just like this book taught, I'm going to turn the other cheek and be Christ-like towards you. So not only did he finance the Book of Mormon, he believed it and he taught the Book of Mormon. Thanks for watching this episode of Restoration Revealed. If you'd like to help us create more, please use the donate link in the description below.